What is the meaning of life? To clarify, all life in the universe. In popular culture, the idea that the meaning of life is in life itself, in healthy hedonism, but most importantly in happiness, has been winning recently. That is, in the process of being, in gaining life experience. But you are unlikely to be satisfied with this answer. The statement, the meaning of life is life itself, feels understated and sometimes false. Every living being has bad times, very bad, so bad that life seems to be a misunderstanding, a senseless mockery of the universe. What is the meaning of life? This is the main question not only of this video, but of the whole world philosophy. It is especially important to answer it today. After all, the entire globe is, as existentialist philosophers would say, in a borderline situation, that is, in a crisis, in a transitional period. This issue is an attempt to give hope, but the main goal is an attempt to prove that the meaning of life is in violation of the laws of physics. We will talk about how life emerged in the universe, inscribed on the rights of exclusion of matter, generating consciousness, and opposing eternal destruction, entropy. Life is a miracle. There is a huge number of living beings around us, big and small, visible and invisible. Even the most primitive plant or animal surpasses in its complexity anything man has ever created. The arrangement of life is so perfect, so optimal in the conditions of our universe, that man has begun to be inspired by nature. You may have heard of a concept called biomimicry. Biomimicry is the imitation of technologies, architecture, in the general sense of design, of forms, structures, and processes that exist in living nature. At the forefront of biomimicry is writer and science popularizer Janine Benyus. She believes that biomimicry is the future. Indeed, why reinvent the wheel when natural selection has already solved a huge number of inventive problems? There are already many examples of successful biomimicry projects. Obviously, there will be more very soon. The diversity of life forms is simply impossible for the human mind to grasp. Life on Earth is incomprehensible, omnipresent, multifaceted. But in the darkness of a hostile cosmos, how did we fragile creatures come to be? We are certainly interested in the moment of origin of life on Earth. The only problem is that we know absolutely nothing about it. We don't know what happened. We don't know where. We don't know when. We don't even know what the origin of life might be considered. We don't know whether the origin of life was a single event. It is likely that life has originated many times, even on our planet, let alone on other potentially habitable planets. However, we do know something about life on Earth for sure. All life on Earth today originates from a single ancestor. This is confirmed by a simple fact. All modern life from the phytobacteria to cedars to humans works the same way. Information is stored in DNA and realized in proteins mediated by RNA. All life on Earth is assembled from the same parts. The discovery of the building blocks of life is perhaps the major discovery of molecular biology in the 20th century. The differences of living organisms are only visible on the surface. Deep down, the same molecular dances are the same. The 20th century scientists who investigated the relatedness of terrestrial life used the same logic that investigators use when trying to distinguish unrelated crimes from those committed by a serial killer. If there are similarities of sufficient complexity between the crime patterns, it indicates that the crimes were committed by the same person. The functioning of all life is so complex and so identical that the following becomes obvious and undeniable. All existing life on this planet has one primordial ancestor. Also, all indications are that this organism was a cell and already possessed DNA, RNA, and proteins. It is believed to have lived on our planet about 3.5 billion years ago. The acronym LUCA, Last Universal Common Ancestor, is used to refer to this mysterious ancestor from the depths of time. Why last? Because between the origin of life, the moment when non-living matter became living matter, and LUCA, the organism to which the lineage of all living things today goes back, there was a mysterious interval of time about which we know nothing. Theoretically, life could have originated, multiplied, and died out millions of years, and millions of times before Luca arose, whose descendants were more fortunate and eventually populated the Earth. That is, there was plenty of other life before Luca, but only Luca descendants survived to our time. The most important unknown in the history of life on Earth is what was there before Luca. Therefore, it is more important for scientists not so much to answer the question of how life arose, because it is simply impossible to give an exhaustive answer, as to the question of how in principle life could arise. More specifically, what could transform inorganic matter into a modern life form, Luca. The most important fundamental event for the history of the Earth, and perhaps the entire universe, the transformation of inanimate into animate, was called abiogenesis. At first glance, the very idea of the random origin of life seems ludicrous. Even the simplest forms of life are very complex. We don't usually encounter random circumstances that result in a multi-story building growing out of dust and a hurricane sweeping through a landfill and picking up a Boeing 747. The Boeing argument belongs to someone who once laughed at the idea of the Big Bang. It belongs to Fred Hoyle. This creationist argument once reduced the idea of abiogenesis to absurdity. But what exactly is it about the assembly of Boeing by a hurricane that confuses us? The point is not the fundamental ability or inability of chaotic events to produce something complex. The point is how complex the spontaneous event that gave rise to life must be. The most famous evidence that hurricanes can collect something from a landfill is the famous Miller-Urey experiment, which in 1953 showed that if you heat and electrocute the simplest molecules in a closed flask for a long time, a mass of complex organic compounds is formed from them. If the American chemist Harold Urey and his student Stanley Miller had produced whole cells in the flask, the mystery would have been solved. The Boeing is assembled and the question of the origin of life is effectively solved, but even the resulting amino acids and sugars are a huge step from non-living to living, and we know for a fact that this step is possible. The metaphor of a Boeing reassembled by a hurricane creates another problem. It's not that the landfill doesn't have the necessary parts, or that the whirlwind can't physically assemble the airplane. These possibilities are provided by the very inclusion of the junkyard and the hurricane in the metaphor. The junkyard is a source of substance where, if you look, you can find anything. A hurricane is an external source of energy with enough force to push the right constituents together. The problem is that a hurricane doesn't know how or what to collide. It doesn't have the information it needs to properly assemble Boeing. And that is a huge amount of information describing every articulation of every element of an airplane, every chemical bond in the case of life. And if the hurricane doesn't know, someone, following the logic of the metaphor, must know. Bingo. The Creator is God. But we have something to answer to such a creationist outcry. Between abiogenesis and the accidental assembly of Boeing by a hurricane, there are several crucial differences. First, no one claims that Boeing, that is Luca, had to assemble all at once, in a single step. On the contrary, it is quite obvious that its assembly went gradually from simpler variants to more complex ones. Moreover, the vast majority of the assembled designs quickly collapsed. Secondly, each of the successful variants had the ability to assemble its own copy. That is, proto-Boeings were supposed to be not so much primitive airplanes as Boeing assembling robots. Finally, there is no reason to believe that the hurricane only hit the junkyard once. We know otherwise. The hurricane hasn't stopped for billions of years. All of this changes the Boeing metaphor beyond recognition, bringing us closer to understanding the origin of Luca. If we imagine that a certain and not very complex combination of parts in a junkyard creates a car that drives around the junkyard, assembling similar cars for itself, then such a car only needs to be assembled once. Next, the assembly cycle will become self-replicating, and over time random changes will lead to diversity through robot evolution. This solves Hurricane's main problem: lack of information. Hurricane doesn't know what needs to be assembled, but someone does. Now, an elementary self-replicating machine is that someone. It has information with which it transforms matter. These robots are the so-called replicators of life, and as far as we can tell, the emergence of replicators under certain circumstances is a fundamental law of the universe. Today you will understand our place in the universe. If you are close to what I do and want to support my work, put a like, leave a comment, and subscribe. First, let's understand the fundamental principles of our world. Life, the world, and the universe are made up of energy. What is energy? Energy is essentially a measure of cause and effect, the currency of interactions in the universe, describing what can change into what can move where, or what can become. Energy is such an inexplicable, indivisible something that does not consist of anything, does not disappear or arise, but appears to us in different incarnations. Mass, heat, motion, wave. Energy flows from one form to another. For example, heat can cause movement. To do something, you need to put energy into it. And if something is done spontaneously, energy is released like light and heat in combustion. In the flow of energy consists of the sequence of all events in the world. The fundamental flow of these events we call time. One of the main forms of existence of energy is matter. That is, energy with mass. The matter we know consists of atoms, particles of energy that have mass. Because of the presence of mass, atoms bounce off each other like billiard balls. All atoms have a similar structure. In the center is a heavy nucleus, which carries almost all of the mass. The nucleus is made up of tightly woven together protons and neutrons, which can be as few as hydrogen or as many as a couple hundred as uranium. Neutrons have only mass, while protons have charge in addition to mass, a special property of matter that exists in two variants that attract each other. These variants we call positive and negative charge. The proton has a plus, while another component of the atom, the electron, has a minus. Basically, the atom is made up of a void. The nucleus of protons with neutrons, the center of gravity, occupies a tiny fraction of space compared to the diameter of the atom. The surface of the atom, on the other hand, consists of an almost weightless electron cloud. The point is that while the atom as a whole resembles a ball, the electron is something quite different. It's both a wave and matter at the same time. It has mass, but no clear position. The probability of its existence is blurred in the space around the atom. Atoms are distinguished by the number of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Atoms with a certain number of protons are called elements. An element is a type of atom with its own unique properties. The simplest element is hydrogen. Hydrogen has one proton and one electron, and usually has no neutrons at all. Carbon, for example, has 6 protons and usually 6 neutrons, while iron has 26 protons and 30 neutrons. The more protons with neutrons, the heavier the atoms. Atoms, in turn, are extremely restless entities. Their restlessness is the cause of all chemical reactions. Most atoms simply cannot help interacting with other atoms, which is the reason why substances, objects, and organisms exist. The reason is dissatisfaction with their base number of electrons. Because of unstable states, atoms are forced to share electrons with each other. A chemical relatively stable bond occurs when the electron clouds of two atoms merge into a single cloud. This fusion happens in many ways. There is a peaceful merger, and there are almost rating, when one atom pulls the cloud over to itself after the merger. At this point, the scenario fork is as follows. Either settle for a part of the cloud, joining the invader, or break away and remain without an electron at all. If the cloud stretches into two nuclei, the two atoms now form a single unit, and such a stable bundle of atoms is called a molecule. The living world does not consist of individual atoms. It consists of their combination of molecules, conglomerates of atoms bound together by common electrons. The molecules of living nature, organic molecules, are characterized by their enormous size. They consist not of 2 or 3 atoms, but of dozens, hundreds, even thousands of atoms folded into complex, 3-dimensional structures. The main component of life is undoubtedly carbon. Why carbon? It has properties unique among the elements. A carbon atom in a molecule can be bonded to 2, 3, or even 4 other atoms, including, and most importantly, with other carbon atoms. This property of carbon so expands the possibilities and variety of molecules composed of it that the study of all configurations is called organic chemistry. The boundary between organic and inorganic molecules is indeed difficult to draw. It would seem that organics are most organic compounds that are composed of carbon and produced by living organisms. But when talking about organics, we somehow get into a gray area. For example, carbon dioxide is a ubiquitous and very simple form of carbon existence that occurs on other planets and without any life. It rather cannot be classified as an organic compound. But urea, a molecule not much more complex but rarer outside the biosphere, can. And that's very important. It is the synthesis of urea from ammonium cyanide realized by the German chemist Friedrich Wöhler, considered the first case of artificial production of an organic compound from an inorganic one. It made a sensation in its time, because with his achievement Wöhler helped to refute the concept of vitalism, according to which the molecules of a living organism contain a special life force that fundamentally distinguishes it from non-living substances. Carbon is a constructive figure. It is ready to cooperate with other atoms on reasonable terms. It quietly combines its electron clouds with those of others into ever larger structures. It is because of the business-like qualities of carbon that living nature exists in the variety we know. In turn, oxygen, the antipode of carbon, is a fierce and destructive element. It tears apart everything it encounters. The force with which it pulls electrons on itself is unrivaled. By wedging itself into other people's molecules, oxygen splits them into separate atoms. By attaching itself to their electron clouds, it breaks the molecules into their simplest compounds. If it captures hydrogen, you get water. If it captures carbon, you get carbon dioxide. A victim molecule, such as the cellulose in paper and wood, may contain several thousand complexly docked carbons. But oxygen is ready to turn all that complexity into simple small inorganic molecules. Some of the energy contained in the electron clouds of the hydrocarbon framework of cellulose is released in the form of light and heat. We call this combustion. At first glance, carbon and oxygen look like enemies. One underpins the structure, the other destroys everything. In fact, there are obvious benefits to combustion. The chemical bonds that constrain a complex molecule contain a huge amount of energy, which can be released if that complex molecule is broken down into simple ones. The burning fuel carries the rocket into space at an unprecedented speed. It is because oxygen does its job that we fly into space. Also, oxygen is used by nature to release vast amounts of energy that can then be utilized. We inhale oxygen to burn the lunch we eat. The dichotomy of carbon and oxygen is cosmically significant to life. Oxygen is really in its nature a destroyer. It can do this so efficiently and so ruthlessly that something radically new is born out of the total destruction it wreaks. Oxygen and carbon as elements embody the properties which, after the origin of life, will form the basis of metabolism. Metabolism has two sides: anabolism, the construction of large molecules with energy expenditure, that is, almost always the construction of carbon chains, and catabolism, the breakdown of large molecules with the release of energy. Together, anabolism and catabolism are locked into a fundamental energy cycle. This system allows us to eat almost anything and somehow effortlessly convert the chemical energy hidden there into thoughts and movements. You could say that metabolism is half of what it means to be alive. But the energy cycle, which in principle fits the definition of metabolism, is found in many systems. In addition to the energy cycle, the concept of being alive includes another cycle, the information cycle. And this is where your attention is needed. We usually perceive information as some transmitted content of anything, but from the physical point of view, information does not necessarily have to be copied somewhere to be information. Information is not the transfer of parameters, it is the parameters themselves. The information of the world order, the world of structurality. The special characteristic of a device is configuration. Information, in turn, is realized in two kinds of organic molecules, proteins and nucleic acids. A protein is not just one molecule, but a type of complex chemical compound. The great thing about proteins is that different DNA bead sequences allow for the creation of completely different molecules from the same set of components. These diverse proteins rule the living organism. As workers in different professions, they do everything. We digest food with the help of proteins, breathe oxygen with the help of proteins, move with the help of proteins. Proteins copy DNA, synthesize the cell membrane, and when forming long-term memory, proteins in the hippocampus send protein signals to other proteins, the cortex. In total, humans have about 20,000 different proteins, but each cell decides for itself when and in what quantities to produce this or that protein. Here, it is simply impossible not to recall the popular Friedrich Engels definition of life. Life is the mode of existence of protein bodies. To the scientists of the 1870s, it seemed that the cell is a clot of protein that from a simple bacterial cell hand in hand to inanimate matter. However, with the development of biology, and especially with the advent of electron microscopes, it became clear that even the most primitive cells are so complex that a person to make up chemically proteins simply cannot. The nucleic acids are DNA and RNA. The power of nucleic acids is to store information about what proteins need to be in order to perform some function. In other words, nucleic acids are in the business of programming proteins. Proteins are not really workers, they are robots. They are made according to special chemical blueprints written in nucleic acids. Physically, both proteins and nucleic acids are chains composed of a sequence of repeating parts, blocks, beads. Due to different sequences of amino acids, different proteins acquire different properties. This abundance of combinations is what gives proteins so many different functions. The thesis is simple: information determines function. Nucleic acids, in turn, are divided into two types, RNA and DNA. They are very similar in molecular composition, but their roles are quite different. DNA has only 4 constituent parts, and they are not so different in chemical composition. But these building blocks, the nucleotides, have a key property called complementarity. Complementarity is the ability of one nucleotide chain to bind to another complementary nucleotide chain if their sequences are related as negative and positive. This property makes nucleotide chains ideal for reproducing a special type of information called hereditary or simply genes. All the genes of an organism are collectively called the genome. A gene is a fragment of the genome, like a chapter of a novel fragment. The genome is written in DNA like a novel is written in a book. Because the sequence of one chain knows the sequence of the other chain, DNA can be copied. With 2 chains, knowing the sequence of one of the chains is enough to establish the entire original molecule. This happens during the division of any cell. DNA is unwound from the double helix into 2 separate strands, and the missing strand is completed by special protein robots according to the principle of complementarity. As a result, 2 identical helices are formed and distributed among daughter cells. That is, nucleic acids, due to their chemical structure, allow copying the information contained in their sequence. In a sense, the complementarity of the DNA chain is the embodiment of the very idea of life. The information in DNA means the protein sequence, and with it what the protein does. Breathing, movement, nutrition, and all the other functions of a living organism. The living cell has a special machine responsible for synthesizing proteins. It is a huge molecular factory called ribosomes, a place where proteins are made using information from DNA. Here, the second of the acids, ribonucleic acid, aka RNA, a relative of DNA, becomes fundamental. In general, DNA is a strict, calm, and stable acid. RNA is much less stable. It is zealous and fleeting, but in some ways much more talented than its stately relative DNA. DNA can do nothing and only solemnly keeps the genes it contains in peace. RNA is no match for proteins in terms of ability, but it can do many things. sometimes even engaging in fundamentally important chemical reactions. Making such a printout is possible, of course, because of complementarity. A special protein called RNA polymerase sits on one of the DNA strands and assembles a complementary strand, only made up of slightly different nucleotides. The whole copying process is called transcription. Transcription is the making of RNA based on a DNA sequence. With transcription begins the journey of the gene, the information written in DNA, into the material world. This process of turning information into function is called central dogma in biology. The central dogma is something like a biological law, a universal principle of operation of every living organism known to us. The central thesis of the central dogma is that information equals function. To imagine how life arose on Earth, it is not at all necessary to imagine how a ready-made cell with DNA, RNA, and proteins emerges from stone and water. You have to imagine the simplest, self-replicating machine imaginable. Then you have to figure out what kind of hurricane and what kind of landfill could have spawned such a machine. This is what abiogenesis researchers do. They try to find the simplest self-reproducing system and come up with a realistic birthplace for it. Even this, however, is very difficult. The origin of the central dogma is like the chicken and egg riddle. To make one organism into another, you have to double its DNA, RNA, and proteins. To make DNA and RNA, you need proteins. To make proteins, you need RNA and DNA. To imagine that one of these molecules came into existence randomly from living components is still possible, though very challenging. But to imagine that all three molecules appear randomly, independently of each other, and spontaneously merge into their own complex molecular dance is too much. Trying to answer the question of the origin of life is like wandering through a dark maze. We have very little data. However, there does seem to be a glimmer of light. Today, the most popular idea is that such simpler beginnings preceding Luca and the central dogma were the so-called RNA-world. This hypothesis is based on the fact already mentioned. RNA is in a sense something between protein and DNA. It can reproduce information and perform chemical reactions at the same time. DNA is a wonderful stable archive, but a DNA molecule can't do anything. Proteins, on the other hand, are perfect multifunctional machines that nevertheless don't know how to replicate themselves. Compared to these two molecules, RNA at first glance is a loser. The archive from it is not very good due to instability, and the machine is mediocre. But RNA is unique in that it can be both an archive and a machine at the same time. Therefore, RNA is central to scientists' fantasies about the origin of life. The easiest way to imagine how the central dogma might have come about is to first imagine a self-sufficient, self-copying RNA molecule, and then how that RNA got hold of proteins by learning how to turn its own four-letter sequence into an entirely new chain of 20 amino acids, that is, DNA. The RNA world is by no means an established fact, not a theory, but only a hypothesis. There is no consensus in the scientific community on this issue, but the majority supports the RNA world hypothesis. Therefore, we can say with great confidence that it is likely that RNA is the original life form whose major event in history was the invention of proteins. In general, if abiogenesis of the RNA world is possible, with 1 billion years and a fraction of imagination, everything else is possible. So the key question about the origin of life today boils down to this: is self-sufficient, self-copying RNA possible? If so, could it have arisen by chance? If so, where? The answer to the first question seems to be yes. You and I are proof of that. Even without having billions of years at our disposal, scientists have already managed to artificially create an RNA system that unrestrictedly self-reproduces itself without the involvement of proteins or any other molecules. The nuance is that this system consists not of a single self-sufficient RNA molecule stringing nucleotide on nucleotide, but of several molecules whose joint activity is closed in a cycle of self-reproduction. Each molecule does something different, but the sum is a copy of the whole system, and that doesn't complicate the hypothesis of the origin of life. On the contrary, it's more realistic. Instead of the birth of one single magic molecule that suddenly starts copying itself, it's easier to imagine a broth of random, diverse molecules, each performing some random chemical reaction. Most of these reactions lead nowhere. But one day, a combination arises that closes into a cycle. Since molecules will double up when this happens, eventually there will be more molecules with useless properties than there are molecules with useless properties. Therefore, the catalytic RNA cycle hypothesis is the most plausible version of the origin of life on Earth. According to this version, life arose at the moment when a random combination of chemical reactions closed into a ring on a dump of molecules, and thus for the first time spun the wheel of continuous reproduction of information, which has not stopped until our days. But there is an obvious question. How did RNA arise then? To understand this, we need to solve several problems. First, we need nucleotides, the individual parts of RNA, to emerge. A nucleotide, of course, is simpler than the whole RNA, but it is still a rather complex molecule, and for a long time its spontaneous origin, without the participation of protein enzymes, seemed unlikely. This is one of the arguments in favor of protein primordiality. Amino acids are simpler than nucleotides, so the spontaneous emergence of proteins requires less imagination than the emergence of RNA. Nevertheless, research shows that a nucleotide core can be efficiently assembled from very simple components under conditions resembling those of ancient Earth. But that's not enough. Nucleotides need to spontaneously combine into chains of sufficient length. In modern organisms, this happens only when DNA or RNA is copied. So, to make a long strand, you need a source in the form of another long strand. But how could such long chains have appeared? Here, the answer to the third question may become fundamental. Where exactly could RNA have appeared? There are many versions about the birthplace of life. One theory is that RNA originated in ice. The physical and chemical properties of ice are such that it can solve the problem of long chains because they are more stable at low temperatures and spatial constraints. In a mixture of water and ice, substances disperse much less than in just water. But ice is bad as a source of matter. It is not quite clear where the source material and energy would come from, because at low temperature all chemical reactions are slower. According to another version, so believe that even Charles Darwin, life appeared in a small warm pond. The classicists saw reservoirs of water in which inorganic substances accumulated, just as salt accumulates in a pot from which water is evaporated. Scientists who now favor the pond version believe that the initial organic matter, the components of future life, may have been carried there by meteorites. Such a small pond solves the problem of matter and space, and the extra energy, the heat of the sun, and the electricity of lightning, allows that matter to turn into living things. In the 1930s, Alexander Oparin supplemented Darwin's idea of a primary broth with the concept of cosorbates, clots of matter resembling the suspension of oil droplets in water. In his view, cosorbates allowed matter to concentrate into even smaller volumes than a small pond, and eventually these clots developed into full-fledged cells. However, neither Darwin nor Oparin had any explanation for the emergence of self-replicating molecules. Today, there are several versions of where these molecules could have originated. The most popular as candidates for the role of the cradle of life are various forms of hydrothermal vents underwater or coastal geysers, through which hot water comes out of the bowels of the earth. The water in hydrothermal springs is rich in a variety of minerals deposited at the fracture site in the form of pipes and columns. The minerals greatly expand the range of possible molecules and their transformations. Therefore, hydrothermal vents become full-fledged chemical reactors, and in the interval from the boiling center to the cold ocean, any optimal temperature can be found in them. And the very difference can be of fundamental importance for mixing of interacting molecules. On the other hand, the thickness of hydrothermal columns is usually porous, which solves the problem of spatial constraints like operands cocerbates. Microscopic voids could serve as confined laboratories for the formation of the first biomolecules. All of this potentially solves the problem of the origin of long RNA strands. The role of hydrothermal vents in the history of life on the planet may well be even greater. Our universal ancestor, Luca, may well have been born there. All of this suggests that hydrothermal vents have been the primary habitat for living organisms for billions of years. The origins of metabolism and energy can be seen in the properties of atoms. In nucleotides and amino acids is seen the foundation of a central dogma carrying genes from the past to the future. What is special about life in this cosmic fundamental hierarchy is that it manages to maintain a very low degree of entropy. It used to be thought that there were two types of cells, one primitive and one advanced, basically single-celled prokaryotes and single-celled eukaryotes. But when sequencing methods, that is gene reading, became available in the 1970s, this hierarchy was shaken. A key role in this was played by Carl Woese, an American microbiologist who was the first to come up with the idea of using gene comparison to reconstruct evolutionary history. Sequencing made it possible to compare organisms not just on a similar-dissimilar basis, but mathematically. By analyzing the differences in DNA, it is possible to compare the time of evolutionary divergence of several groups. In general terms, the principle is that mutations in genes occur more or less regularly if we average time intervals on the scale of millions of years. In general, the more two species differ in the same gene region, the more they exist independently of each other. That is, the older their evolutionary divergence. If a human has G written somewhere in the genome, and a mouse has G, and a cockroach has C, then we diverged from the cockroach earlier than we did from the mouse because our sequences are very different. Using this method, Carl Woese was the first to calculate a large-scale, genetically accurate tree of life. If we take not 3 species, but thousands and not 5 letters, but long segments of the genome, then theoretically it is possible to find out in a similar way what kind of family ties, who is related to whom. That is, to restore the whole sequence of evolutionary events that gave rise to the diversity of today's species. To date, this tree has been calculated by evolutionary biologists in minute detail, although there are enough controversial areas on it. Without such knowledge of the relationships between living organisms, it is simply impossible to imagine modern science. But even that very first Woese tree, which described life on Earth in the most general terms, revolutionized our view of the natural system. The DNA sequences that Woese sequenced were divided when analyzed not into 2 branches, eukaryotes and prokaryotes, as one might assume, but into 3. These branches were called domains, that is, groups above kingdoms, like the animal kingdom or the plant kingdom. It turned out that there was simply no such domain as prokaryotes. Prokaryotes are not a single group, but 2 different variants of living organisms, as far apart in evolutionary coordinates from each other as a person from yogurt. Outwardly, they look very similar, but a comparison of their genes shows that they have evolved independently of each other for billions of years. One of these groups is bacteria. The other group used to be considered a subgroup of bacteria called Archaebacteria. Woese elevated her status to a separate domain, and the bacteria from the name fell away. The new domain of Archaea fell into line with bacteria and eukaryotes. Today, many evolutionary biologists want to reconsider the triple division of life as well. They believe that eukaryotes, you and me, did not appear at the same time as the other 2 domains of life, but significantly later. Bacteria, and probably Archaea, had long existed by the time they emerged, and on a planetary scale, and in large numbers. Eukaryotes, on the other hand, evolved from Archaea. This is why all multicellulars, that is, all plants, fungi, insects, and animals, are part of one big family. With the advent of genetic sequencing in the 1970s, biologists rushed to sequencing every living thing they could find. Today, they are sequencing even what they can't find. There are millions of species that we know about but have never seen. It turns out it's a kind of genetic dark matter. In 2010, such a sample was pulled from a hydrothermal vent called Loki's Castle between Greenland and Norway. It contained genes sorted by scientists into thousands of species, which entire teams of specialists had been digging through for several years. In 2015, Swedish bioinformaticians from Thijs Etema's group discovered in the endless canvases of four-letter code what can only be compared to Archaeopteryx. This fossil is half bird, half lizard, a legendary symbol of evolution, first found 2 years after the publication of The Origin of Species. Archaeopteryx represents the classic transitional form between the two modern branches of evolution. So too, the archaea found in the gene databases from Loki's Castle represent a transitional form between the rest of the archaea and us. Importantly, in them we found the rudiments of the genes for one of the principal inventions of eukaryotes, moving membranes. With the discovery of the Asgardian archaea, the logic of Eukaryogenesis began to become clearer. It is almost certainly known that eukaryotes originate from the union of archaea with bacteria under oxygen pressure. Responsibility for this ultimately lies with photosynthesis, which pumped the planet full of the toxic gas and brought anaerobic, oxygen-free life to the brink of extinction. At the same time, there was a group among the archaea that could not breathe but possessed a mobile, bendable membrane. Perhaps they were the first predators in nature, already able to devour other people's cells whole. Some bacteria have figured out a way to neutralize oxygen by adapting it as the bottom step of the electron transport chain. The respiration that arose in this way allowed these organisms not only to solve the problem of oxygen toxicity by expanding the habitable spaces for themselves, but also to harness the power of oxygen to multiply the efficiency of nutrients. These enterprising bacteria are the ancestors of mitochondria. At some point, both of these ancestors realized that they were good together. The bacterium is protected from other predators that might eat it, and the archaea suddenly has 10 times the energy that the oxygenated bacterium stamps on it. And so, this bacterium becomes a semi-independent organelle with a permanent home in the archaeal cytoplasm. This moment of fusion of two domains can be considered the birth of the third, eukaryotic. However, as with the moment of origin of life, endosymbiosis could be stretched for millions of years. You and I already know where this is going. We emerged from the opposition to oxygen, which eventually made us many times stronger. The emergence of eukaryotes marks the union of two ways of exploiting an environment, seemingly designed for each other: predation and respiration. The former allows the transformation of entire alien organisms into nutrients. The latter maximizes energy from the nutrients. So, a eukaryote with a mitochondrion is not just a ship on which genes sail through time, but a veritable Death Star, a fundamental new word in living nature. With the emergence of eukaryotes, there's a turning point. Bacteria are creatures of plurality, interacting not as individual organisms, but as whole populations, that is, strains. However, eukaryotes for the first time begin to operate not only as strains, but also as individuals. Conventionally speaking, at some point in the past, there was an archaea with a breathing bacterium inside, and there was a genetically exactly the same archaea, but without the bacterium. The first archaea won, not because it had better genes, but because its individual life as an organism was more productive. It managed to acquire a mitochondrion. For the average unicellular prokaryote, only the set of genes within the cell mattered. With the advent of endosymbiosis, in which some cells live in other cells, it is not just genetic information that becomes important, but the personal history of the organism. An account of our evolutionary bid for perfection within a generation must be made from this point. A structure made of eukaryotic cells is a great investment that requires competent realization in long life. Eukaryotes are interested in long-term survival, whereas bacteria can afford to waste 99% of the population and get back to baseline numbers in a couple hours. A eukaryotic organism is the large-scale product of a massive energy extraction operation. It takes time and large amounts of nutrients to produce. Therefore, the very fact that eukaryotes, these nuclear missile carriers, exist directs their evolution toward further complexity. The result is sexual reproduction, which increases variability per generation, multicellularity, which allows the creation of new organisms without the extinction of old ones, and the brain, which allows adaptation to the environment in seconds rather than millions of years, as well as teeth, claws, stingers, spears, and nuclear missiles. You and I are eukaryotes, and from the very beginning we staked on complexity and are still reaping the benefits of that decision, dealing now with a complex human society. But for whom is this development happening? For whom do we do what we do? What makes us live, move, act? A bacterium, for example, is driven by its genes, that is, by the history of its ancestors. These genes, carrying the memory of all the vicissitudes of its evolutionary destinies, create the bacterium as a means of survival. Therefore, it cannot but follow their interests. It is in the interests of the genes that the bacterium multiply. The bacterium is a copy of its ancestors, so with rare random exceptions it does exactly the same thing in everything. A bacterium lives for its own kind by definition. Like bacteria, we mimic our ancestors in many ways. Yet each person is unique and different from their parents, from their fingerprints to their character. If bacteria inherit all the parameters of the parental organism, then humans inherit the general principles of its structure. And this gives us more freedom in the movement of development. It gives us the ability to think and ask the question, who is this all for? Bacteria have no motivations other than genetic motivations. For a bacterium, there's no meaning to the question of whether it's doing something for itself or for its own kind. It's the same thing to it. But a human can go against genes, against the past, against the will of his own family. And all because multicellular organisms are not just many cells, they are many cells working as one. Here we are obliged to talk about ants. From a human height, all ants seem the same. Some ants grow mushrooms and herd livestock underground. Others glue houses together out of leaves. Still others are constantly at war with clans. All the impressive abilities of ants, from the formation of complex communities by farming to the creation of giant armies, are possible because these animals know how to act in groups. Humans are also collective beings, but our collectivity is organized quite differently. We pay taxes and obey traffic laws because we know we are socially responsible. But it is still impossible to explain to a non-human animal why, in principle, it is necessary to do something against one's will. How is it that ants suddenly put society above the individual? Why would an ant fight in the army when its chances of survival in the rear are much better? Who is this ant fighting for? The ant is fighting for the queen, of course. An ant colony usually consists of a huge number of workers, some of whom may be soldiers or some other cog in ant society, who are ruled by the prolific queen, their mother. The laborers work selflessly for the benefit of the mother and her offspring. From the height of our perceptions, all this looks like a well-thought-out strategy, like a state system. But the dedication of ordinary ants is of a very different nature. It's because worker ants don't know how to reproduce. The peculiarity of ant society is that it is divided into breeding and non-breeding castes. It is this, the so-called eusociality, that explains all the remarkable abilities of ants. The essence of the worker ant is that it never evolved on its own. All its genes are given to it by the ant's queen. In fact, all ants are distant organs of the queen. The ant sincerely wants to build an anthill and fight for the queen because he is part of her body. She gives the worker his genes, in which it is written down exactly what this worker should do for her. Any anthill is a superorganism. If a worker ant could reproduce, it would surely have children, loyal maternal grandmothers to a slightly greater or lesser degree. And over time, the workers would have gotten rid of the loyalty genes. If you breed, evolution works for you. But if you don't breed, Evolution works for the one who does breed. In connection with worker ants, one cannot help but think of Eukaryotes in human history. As barbaric as the act of castration may seem now, it usually had a very definite purpose: to deprive a man of offspring. Because of this, a person's motivational systems are completely reorganized. It's not just that Eukaryotes won't molest the wives of the men around them. Eukaryotes have no need to worry about their own inheritance, which means they are safe for those who are thinking about their dynastic interests. Eukaryotes were listed as advisors to Chinese and Roman emperors, and in the Islamic world they made up an entire political class. In fact, the reasoning about ants and Eukaryotes was necessary for us to get to the main principle of organization of multicellular organisms. Let's think about us. Most of the cells in our bodies are akin to worker ants. Almost our entire body is made of cells whose genes are, strictly speaking, doomed to die. Cells of the skeleton or internal organs contain DNA just as eggs and sperm cells do. But skin or brain DNA will never make it outside our body, and thus will never produce offspring. So most of the body's cells are an evolutionary dead end. Only individuals of a privilege, one might say elite group of germ cells, and their precursors in the testes and ovaries, have a chance to leave a genetic trace in history. These two castes of cells of the organism, multiplying infinitely and multiplying limitedly, have names. The cells of muscles, skin, liver, brain, and basically the cells that make up our body are called somatic cells, from the Greek word soma, meaning body. They are, as you realize, the vast majority. Soma is dead end. From an evolutionary point of view, worker cells, which are subordinate to the minority of multiplying cells living in the reproductive organs. The same ones carry genetic information like the Olympic flaying from grandparents through mom and dad to grandchildren and so on. They are the ones who set the body's properties, conducting the genes of all the other cells. Like an ant's uterus, these multiplying cells produce for their own purposes the subsidiary bodies that is you and me. The passing of the baton, the unbroken line that connects generations, is reflected in the name of these elite cells of a multicellular organism. They are called the germ line or germplasm. Soma and germplasm do not separate immediately. Immediately after fertilization, they are a single unit because at that point, the entire embryo is a single cell with a double set of chromosomes or zygote. The division into two castes of cells in humans does not occur until the 3rd week of development. The zygote is initially split into 2, 4, 8 cells, and after 3 weeks, when the cells are already thousands, among them isolated group, which is destined to develop into precursors of sex cells, ovaries or testes, depending on sex. This is the germplasm. The remaining cells will form bones, skin, and organs, but these are all dead ends, mortal matter. Disposable soma. The goal of the germ line is immortality, and it can only achieve it through germ cells, because only from there can the genes go to the next generation. That means that only the germplasm genes determine the properties of the descendants, including the properties of their soma. So, from a single-cell perspective, multicellularity is a form of social relations in which a minority of cells engaged in sexual reproduction subjugate the majority of cells doomed to die. The most interesting and frightening thing here is that we look at the world precisely from the perspective of the doomed cells. Our consciousness, all that we call I, is a dead-end branch of evolution, produced by the movement of our germplasm. On the one hand, this sounds depressing. In fact, in the separation of soma and germplasm is the main source of our freedom. If we were one with our germ line, we could not fundamentally go against our genes. Just as bacteria cannot go against their genes. But soma in principle, there is absolutely nothing stopping us from disobeying the germplasm. There are more details in the complex design of a multicellular organism than there are genes in the genome. Nevertheless, all the instructions for these details must fit into a single cell sent from generation to generation. Therefore, the more complex such an organism is, the more freedom it has from its own genes. The rest of the information soma cells, that is us, receive from each other and the environment. The culmination of this anti-genetic free will is the formation of a special machine that throughout its life learns new instructions not mentioned in any genes at all. This device we call the brain. Thanks to sexual reproduction, we are different from our ancestors. Thanks to multicellularity, we are able to think for ourselves. But we pay dearly for this uniqueness. No matter how much we rise above our germplasm, no matter how much we ignore the power of our own genes, one aspect of our relationship remains immutable. The germplasm continues to exist, and soma, that is, our body, and by extension, consciousness, will have to go sooner or later. Death is a new element in the typical life cycle of a living organism. Of course, single-celled creatures have died before. Apart from the relatively recent prospect of being eaten, any ancient cell could easily have been left without a food source and simply dissolved in the ocean, or even boiled in some boiling fountain. For a single-celled cell, death means defeat, and a single-celled cell has no other task. But for a multicellular organism, death is not defeat, it's part of the program. Why does a multicellular organism have to die? First of all, it should be noted that for the average living being, the question is not why death is necessary in principle, but who, when, and how it will be eaten. Fantasy on the theme of eternal life is a luxury of exclusively human thinking. In principle, turning to science fiction, it is quite possible to imagine a non-aging multicellular organism. An eternal organism is not the same as a perpetual motion machine. There can't be perpetual motion machines because that would require getting energy from nowhere. An eternal organism does not necessarily need to create energy at all. On the contrary, it needs to eat well all the time, get vitamins and antioxidants along with its food to keep its eternal body in an eternal state. An eternal living being does not contradict the laws of biology or physics. Yet there are no eternal organisms. Any organism will age and die sooner or later. The reason for the existence of aging is a very complex and ambiguous question. It would seem incomparably cheaper, from an evolutionary point of view, to extend the life of the old. So why hasn't this happened over millions of years of evolution? We have several versions. One theory is that the probability of reproduction decreases with age. The older you are, the more amazing it is that you haven't been eaten yet, which means that health problems that manifest themselves with age are worse affected by natural selection. Cancer in children is a big problem for the population. Cancer in old people has little effect on the gene pool. According to another theory, there is a kind of technical support for the organism, including protection against DNA damage, written into the DNA. But this technical support has to share funding with the reproduction department, so evolution divides the budget between them, because of which sooner or later the contract for technical support simply expires, and the organism dies from the accumulation of mutations. The cycle of life and death, birth and decay, change and adaptation ensured the multicellularity of Earthlings. The reason for the imminent mortality of organisms is not that the organism is bound to fail. The point is that the germplasm simply does not need eternal organisms. Its concerns are not organismal, but evolutionary. Hermoplasma needs to move forward to stay alive. Bacteria, the eternal collectivists, for all their group approach to problem solving, always remain individual cells. At the same time, Eukaryotes, having adopted individualism as a principle of life, now and then try to make some hypercell from different cells, like a superorganism in ants. A diploid is something that merges the genes of the father and mother, works as a single organism, but is controlled by two sets of genes. Paradoxically, having transcended our eukaryotic empire of predators and egoists, we have become more interested in our own kind. There's a deeper theme here than cells sticking together, the evolutionary emergence of the new from the aggregation of the old. After all, life is a layering of levels, each composed of components of the previous one, but not reducible to those components. A multicellular organism is not just many cells. A cell is more than a bunch of chromosomes and proteins. Molecules are not just a collection of atoms. In each of these cases, the whole is more than the sum of the components. This phenomenon has many names: synergy, holism, systemic effect. But the most appropriate word is probably emergence. Emergence is the idea that something is greater than the sum of its components. A molecule is not just a few atoms, it is also their particular configuration. A sentence is not just a set of words, it is the meaning that grows out of their relationship. A melody is not just a certain number of notes, it's how they relate in time. The whole point is that a system has properties that its components do not have. That's what emergence is. But in the case of ever-moving living nature, emergence is not just a convenient term, not just a concept or an idea. It is a long-term strategy for informational survival, a way to eternally create new things where the possibilities seem to be exhausted. As you listen to and comprehend this layered disciplinary narrative, think about ancient eukaryotic ancestors and their insatiable pursuit of perfection. The process we call evolution is driven by the fact that nothing ever stays the same. Living things have only two mutually exclusive possibilities: to allow entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, that is chaos, to take over, or entropy to be resisted. The second law of thermodynamics states that the heat of a hotter system only transfers to the side of a colder system. This irreversible process leads to great chaos, universal destruction, wars. It leads to darkness. In order for heat to transfer from a colder system to a hotter one, there must be an external influence, the influence of life. But entropy is not the only law operating in the world. There are also oppositely directed processes. Creation and growth operate to the same extent as decomposition and death. Stars are born, planets collapse, beautifully ordered crystals form, new life forms develop, and cultures appear. Each time order in a system is raised to a new degree rather than destroyed. Non-entropy, the force opposite to entropy, is at work. Humanity's achievement is a discovery that supports the cause of our defense against entropy. This is as true for science as it is for art. For art structures our electrical essence, our nervous system, our consciousness. Entropy is the most general law of nature, stating that any complex system sooner or later breaks down, and order turns into disorder. Parasites are a living manifestation of entropy. They find a way to attach themselves to a more complex organism, and with almost no effort, suck out its energy, often killing their host. However, entropy's victory is by no means predetermined. When we fight entropy, we are immediately rewarded. Every moment we enjoy creation, one's consciousness is filled with happiness. In such moments, one realizes one's true role. Thank you for watching. Special thanks to sponsors. If you want to support my channel, put a like and subscribe.